protests turn violent. Antifa may be behind it, but what is Antifa? And where does it come from? Welcome back to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. Antifa. It's one of the groups blamed for the violent rioting and looting we've seen during protests across the U.S. in the last 3 weeks. But what exactly is Antifa? And why have we been hearing so much about it in the last few weeks? In some ways, you might think of Antifa as being like opposite Ku Klux Klan. Antifa is short for anti-fascist. They say they're anti-Nazi and anti-racism, versus the Ku Klux Klan, which is obviously pro-racism. But in other ways, Antifa is not the opposite. Antifa is more like the far-left version of the far-right KKK. Antifa is secretive about its membership. They wear black outfits and cover their faces, and they justify using violent tactics to achieve their political goals. Now, I can say this without slandering anyone in particular, because many activists aligned with Antifa say Antifa doesn't really exist. As this Antifa website explains, Antifa isn't an organization. There's no membership, no meetings, no dues, no rules, no leaders, no structure. It is literally an idea and nothing more. Wait, Antifa isn't an organization and has no structure. So who runs this webpage? Let's see, about us, who owns this site, none of your concern. Okay, so Antifa doesn't exist. But when they do, it's none of my concern. But what about this other Antifa group, Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon? Their website says they were founded in October 2007. So they are an organization? Well, it's complicated. According to Mark Bray, the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, Antifa is part of militant anti-fascism, which is an illiberal politics or activity of social revolutionism applied to fighting the far right by communists, anarchists, socialists, and other radicals. And the history of Antifa goes back way earlier than a couple of websites. It may have started in the 1920s. According to the German booklet, 80 Years of Anti-Fascist Action, by a former Antifa member, the idea of Antifa originally came from the Soviet Union's United Front strategy during the Third World Congress in Moscow in 1921. And that Soviet idea evolved into the German Antifa of the 1930s. The name comes from the German anti-fascist something. They shortened it to Antifa. As the Socialist Jacobin magazine describes it, Antifa was formed just before Hitler rose to power, and they tried to stop him. They drew on the slogans and orientation of the pre-war United Front strategy, adopting the word Antifa from a last-ditch attempt to establish a cross-party alliance between communist and social democratic workers in 1932. This is an Antifa conference in Germany in 1932. The movement was soon crushed by the Nazis. Then in 1945, after the Allies finished kicking Nazi butts, Antifa groups started to come together again across Europe. But the Allies were like, nah, we've got enough communists to deal with already. So, as the US and Great Britain sought to rebuild Europe under more moderate leadership, they crushed Antifa groups. Meanwhile, communist states in Europe also crushed Antifa groups. The funny thing about communist states is that they really don't like other communists. Plus, they wanted to use the anti-fascist brand themselves. For example, communist East Germany called the Berlin Wall the anti-fascist protective barrier. Then in the 1980s, there was a resurgence of neo-Nazism in Germany, and new Antifa-like groups formed in response. There was a group of militant leftists in the late 1980s called the Red Warriors in Europe, who fought neo-Nazi skinheads. and anti-capitalist autonomous political groups also fought neo-Nazis. They came up with the tactic known as Black Bloc. These groups dressed in black with their faces covered by motorcycle helmets, balaclavas, or other masks to create a uniform, anonymous mass of revolutionaries prepared to carry out militant actions, sometimes involving weapons such as flagpoles, clubs, projectiles, and Molotov cocktails. And in the US in the 1980s, where racism seemed like a more immediate threat than fascism, we saw the group Anti-Racist Action. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there were also Antifa-like groups opposing capitalism and globalism. Black Bloc tactics were used, for example, during the 1999 Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization. The most recent incarnation of these far-left anti-fascist groups is what we now call Antifa. Here they are just before they started a riot on the campus of UC Berkeley in 2017. And here's an Antifa protester at a George Floyd protest in Boston just a few weeks ago. And as you can see, the modern Antifa flag is based on the original German anti-fascist whatever of the 1930s. There are also Antifa groups across Europe, like Italy, Spain, and of course Germany. But there's a fundamental problem with giving a history of Antifa this way. Because while all those anti-fascist groups have the same core principle, which is they're against fascism, they're not a single or continuous organization. According to Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray, which is supportive of Antifa, despite the various shades of interpretation, Antifa should not be understood as a single-issue movement. Instead, it is simply one of a number of manifestations of revolutionary socialist politics broadly construed. Some Antifa groups are more Marxist, while others are more anarchist or anti-authoritarian. That being said, all Antifa groups are against what they view as fascism. But what is fascism? According to Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, fascism is notoriously difficult to pin down. So instead of pinning it down, the author cites historian Robert Paxton, who defines fascism as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Okay, so there is a lot going on there. But it seems pretty specific to governments or leaders who are trying to abandon democratic liberties and are focused on external expansion. And it doesn't seem to be an accurate depiction of what's happening in America right now. I mean, Donald Trump has been screaming in all caps for more free speech on social media. And he's also rallied against America's endless wars, and American soldiers acting as police in other countries. Even Vox, which does not like Trump, talked to 5 experts who are all like, well, actually, he's a right-wing populist. But as long as Trump does not advocate the abolition of America's democratic institutions and their replacement by some sort of post-liberal new order, he's not technically a fascist. But don't worry, because Antifa can just paint a broader definition of fascism to be against. For example, all police are fascist. Not these police. The other police. Yeah, these ones. And also, what's fascist is capitalism. Antifa is anti-capitalism. Because obviously what's good is communism. Under communism, you don't have police states. Well, okay, fine. Look, there's some lack of clarity about the definition of fascism, but it seems like Antifa defines fascism more broadly than most Americans would. And making this even more complicated is that while Antifa all claim to be against fascism, whatever that may be, different Antifa groups are not necessarily all for the same thing. Author Mark Bray writes that, to some extent, the predominance of one faction over the other can be discerned in a group's flag logo, whether the red flag is in front of the black, or vice versa, or whether both flags are black. In other cases, one of the two flags can be substituted with the flag of a national liberation movement, or a black flag can be paired with a purple flag to represent feminist Antifa, or a pink flag for queer Antifa, etc. Oh great, now we have to keep track of all the flags. I wonder what happens if you put the Antifa logo on a North Korean flag. Would that be pro-North Korea because North Korea is communist and against American imperialism, or anti-North Korea because they're also a police state? Anyway, in the US recently, most Antifa groups have been anarchist or anti-authoritarian since the emergence of modern Antifa under the name Anti-Racist Action in the late 80s. In a 2016 Obama administration report, the Department of Homeland Security concluded that anarchist extremist violence in the US was mostly anti-capitalist, anti-police, and pro-social justice. And all that brings us to 2017, the year President Trump took office. For Antifa, Trump has been a blessing. They see him as the embodiment of fascism, even though, as Vox points out, he's not. On Trump's inauguration day, in January 2017, a masked Antifa activist punched Richard Spencer, a white nationalist. In February, protesters at UC Berkeley, including Antifa, used violence to stop a speech on campus by conservative personality Milo Yiannopoulos. In March, Antifa protesters in Vermont assaulted Charles Murray, a conservative political scientist. In August, Antifa protesters faced off with white nationalists and other right-wing protesters at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And that was just in 2017, and we thought that was a rough year. Anyway, since Antifa is heavily composed of anarchists, its activists place little faith in the state, which they consider complicit in fascism and racism. They prefer direct action. They pressure venues to deny white supremacists space to meet. They pressure employers to fire them and landlords to evict them. And when people they deem racist and fascist manage to assemble, Antifa's partisans try to break up their gatherings, including by force. So from Antifa's perspective, white nationalists are fascists and must be stopped. But, as members of a largely anarchist movement, anti-fascists don't want the government to stop white supremacists from gathering. They want to do so themselves, rendering the government impotent. And that's basically what happened in 2020. The rioters that often come on the tail end of George Floyd protests, they may not all be part of an Antifa group, but they have rendered state and local governments impotent as they set fire to things and destroy property. In Seattle, protesters that include but are not limited to Antifa have set up CHOP, the Capitol Hill Organized Protest. It's a sort of anarchist paradise. Well, it's not a paradise for the two people who were shot there last weekend. This cop-free zone is being patrolled in part by the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club, a left-wing militia that has been described as the armed wing of Antifa. Check out our episode, Attacked Inside CHOP, for more on that. So these violent tactics are being supposedly used to fight fascism. But Antifa protesters have also been criticized for becoming the very problem they rally against. As left-wing intellectual Noam Chomsky put it, Antifa is a major gift to the right because it can be criticized for its use of violent tactics and shutting down free speech. And those things just bring more attention and support to the people Antifa want to silence. Chomsky also called Antifa generally self-destructive. Remember, politically, Antifa is illiberal. They do not want people they think are fascist to have free speech. And Antifa says using violence is justified because it's a form of self-defense. It's worth noting, though, that not all of what Antifa does is violent. They also organize rallies and do online doxing. That is, exposing the identities of people who they think are white supremacists. And Antifa is not a single organization with a single history. It's a loose coalition of decentralized groups that may or may not directly communicate with each other and may or may not have membership, from Rose City Antifa, that's been around since 2007, to whoever made the We Anti-Fascist website, and that's none of your business. What do you think? Leave your comments below. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.